All right, the title of this message is How to Ruin a Perfectly Good Psalm. Okay, if you're new to the church and new to reading your Bible, you might have heard of something like this, or maybe you've experienced this yourself. If you're old to reading the Bible and you've been reading it a while, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You'll be reading a psalm, and it's like flowery language that just reminds you of how awesome God is. Wonderful poetry, tremendous imagery, praise, gratitude, wonder, majesty. And then the psalmist says, hey, could you kill my enemies for me? And you're like, what? And this sort of happens, right? And you're like, it's kind of ruining the vibe here. And I was having this like good time of prayer, and now I have to deal with this? Like, I didn't really want to deal with this. And it happens more and more than we realize in the Psalms. Now, we could talk about this sort of culturally, right? Because, for up until a few years ago, we were able to live in the bubble of suburbia. And the best part of suburbia is you don't have to see or think about the bad things, right? And until we got smartphones in our pockets that tell us bad things all the time. But generally speaking, we don't have to think about seeing the bad things. But David, who wrote most of the Psalms, he had a lot of people who tried to kill him. They stole his family from him. They stole his throne. His sons betrayed him. His general betrayed him. He had all kinds of people who would betray him and hurt him. And that's just not David. Like, he had a castle around him. A lot of the folks in the ancient Near world had to reckon with the fact that bands of marauders or raiders could come in and steal all their stuff and their people without any regard at any point in time. People dealt with the threat of death and enemies all the time. And they needed to think about it, and they needed to figure out how to pray about it. I want to give you Exhibit A. We're going to be reading through Psalm 139 today. And I think Psalm 139 might be one of the biggest splashes of amazing revelation in the entire Bible. It was written by David in 1000 BC, and he says unbelievably amazing things. And we'll get to look through those verses, but I want to skip ahead towards the... I'm going to skip ahead to the disturbing stuff, all right? So you can open up your Bible to Psalm 139, or you can go ahead and read with me. I'm going to read towards the end of the psalm. He had said all these great things about God. 3 different sections of 6 verses. The last section of 6 verses goes this. If only you, God, would slay the wicked. Away from me, you who are bloodthirsty. They speak of you, speaking of God, with evil intent. Your adversaries misuse your name. Do I not hate those who hate you, Lord, and abhor those who are rebellion against you? I have nothing but hatred for them. I count them my enemies. All right, in Jesus' name we pray. What are you doing with that, right? That kind of messes up your psalm on a regular basis. And if we are going to pray the scriptures and allow these scriptures to shape us, we need to kind of deal with this. I've always told my kids, and I've told from this stage, we don't have enemies. Like, you might, just because somebody disagrees with you ideologically, they are not your enemy. Like, most of us don't have like the enemies out there. Other parts of the world, they look at us and like, you don't really have enemies. But we do experience evil. And we do have people who make themselves our enemies. Many of us have experienced abuse or theft or crime. You've experienced betrayal. These things we have experienced. I always taught my kids that like hate was a 4-letter word. You can't use the word hate. We don't have nothing to hate really around here. Just don't use the word hate. Don't overuse the word hate. But here you have David using the word hate. And there are some things to hate. Racism, abuse, corruption, entitlement. There are things to hate. We do live in an evil world. And unfortunately, and I've participated in this like kindness-driven modern Christianity, modern suburban Christianity, rarely equips us with what's needed to deal with evil and enemies. So today, we're going to learn how to deal with that a little bit. We're going to learn from the psalm. We're going to learn from the psalmists in general. And I want to give you the bottom line or the secret on the front end, and then tell you how the psalmist gets there. I told you that the Psalm 139 is broken into 4 6-verse sections. I read the first 4 verses of the last section. At the end of the entire psalm, and we'll work our way through it, he says this. He says, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there's any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." In the face of his enemies, he's going to ask God to search him. Now, what does David know that doesn't allow him to be utterly swallowed up with anger against his enemies? Well, he's learned to pray in a certain way, all right? So how can you pray? And I'm going to give you 4 ways to pray, all right? We're in a series called Prayer for Normal People. We've taught a little acrostic when it comes to pray. P for pause, P for pause, all right? To enter into the presence of God is a big deal, and so we need to pause and kind of collect ourselves and not just jump right in there. R is rejoice. We need to learn to hold the pain of our lives and what's right in this world in the same heart. Pain and joy can be in the same heart at the same time. We need to learn to ask, and to ask boldly, and to ask specifically, and to ask with great expectation that we have a good Father that wants to give us all good things. And then finally, the Y is yield. As we're praying, we're interacting with God. And if God's going to call us to something, and if we're going to be honest, we need to learn to yield to his direction and his purposes. In many ways, the teaching today is going to go towards enabling us to yield well. All right? So how are we going to do that? I got 4 points out of this passage. First, you got to be the hater. You're going to have to accept the fact that you're going to feel hate. Accept the fact that you're going to feel people as enemies. And I want to walk through why, okay? One of the things that's really served me really well through the years is on occasion I'll buy a devotional. I'll use it in the evening, or sometimes I'll use it in the morning. It'll have a verse, or a few verses, and I'll do some teaching. Oftentimes in those devotionals, particularly in the Psalms, it tends to avoid the hate language and the enemy language. It just has less of that. I think part of it is because suburban Christians have the money to buy those devotionals, and suburban Christians don't think that they're dealing with hate and enemies as much as we might think we are, right? And so, but avoiding the enemy language in the Psalms is problematic. And I want you to hear how Eugene Peterson, an author, speaks to that. He says, to cut out enemy language in the Psalms is wrong-headed because our hate needs to be prayed, not suppressed. Hate is our emotional link with the spirituality of evil. It is the volcanic eruption of outrage when the holiness of being, ours or another's, has been violated. What he's saying is that if we're going to take ourselves seriously, we're going to take this world seriously, we're going to need to deal with the honest reality of our emotional response to evil. And it ought to feel like hate. He continues saying this. As Kant, Western philosopher from 200 years ago, as Kant said, evil is radical. We didn't know things were this bad. Neither our minds or our emotions are prepared to deal with this. When we experience evil, it almost always surprises us and often produces a strong sense of emotion. So we thrash about, we sputter in outrage, we curse the so recently identified enemy, and we demand vengeance. Peterson continues, he says, we have been brought up, most of us, interpreting what is wrong in the world on a grid of moralism. Moralism trains us to make cool, detached judgments. Deep down, the moralist suspects that there are no, or at least not very many, real victims. And keep going. The moralist thinks that people get what is coming to them. In the long run, people reap what they sow. The rape victim, the unemployed, the emotionally ill, the prisoner, the refugee. I would add the addict. I would add the depressed. I would add those with chronic sickness. The moralist thinks if we were privy to all the details, they would see that, in fact, they asked for it. The Psalms will have none of this. The Psalms assume a moral structure to life, but their main work is not to train us in judgmental moralism, but to grapple with evil. Their praying insights have identified an enemy, and they respond in outrage. They hate what they see on behalf of the dispossessed, the mocked, the dehumanized of the earth. They pour into the ears of God their sightings of the enemy, not siphoning off hate, but channeling it in effective ways in covenantal shapes. Go back to that slide just one moment. It says, channeling it in effective ways, right? When we numb ourselves to the disappointment we see and we feel, we train ourselves into apathy. And what he's saying is when we see it and when we call it out, we channel it in effective ways in covenantal shapes. What does he mean by that? We are in a covenant with the Creator. That the Creator is willing to listen to us. And the Creator is, that God is love and God is fully just. And so when we call out to the loving God who's fully just, we say, this is wrong. We don't like this. We don't believe in this. This isn't what we see in you. Why are you allowing this, right? And what ends up happening is that we then become prayers, right? What your phone is doing right now, generally speaking, is it's trying to make you a victim. Either you're a victim as somebody who hasn't consumed enough, you're a victim to somebody else who has more than you, you're a victim to a political system. Your phone is shouting out to you, you are a victim, and therefore you need to click more, or you need to buy more, you need to sit on your couch and listen to us more, right? This world continues to want to shout you out as a victim, right? But prayer is the one thing that victims won't do. Because if you're praying, therefore you feel like you have agency. If you're praying, you know somebody on the inside who can do something about it. And therefore, the covenant in the relationship with your Creator says, I can do something about this, and I'm not going to sit back passively. And I'm not just going to click more, and I'm not going to just react to whatever the world wants to form me for. I'm going to see that evil. I'm not going to turn my eyes away from it. In fact, I'm going to get upset about it, but I'm not going to go post about it. I'm going to bring it into the very presence of God. Keep going with what Eugene Peterson says. He says, hate is often the first sign that we care. If we are far gone, our complacency is often the only emotion with enough velocity to penetrate our protective smugness and draw the red blood that will make us pay attention. That doesn't mean that prayer legitimizes hate. It uses it. Go on. Human hate is not a very promising first step to the establishment of righteousness. That's an understatement. Nevertheless, when prayed, they are first steps into the presence of God, where we learn that He has ways of dealing with what we bring Him that are both other and better than what we had in mind. But until we are in prayer, this convicted me. Until we are in prayer, we are not teachable. It is better to pray badly than not to pray at all. A ship that is dead in the water cannot be steered. Hate drives us. It drives us out of our apathy. It drives us out of our need to kind of look away, to distract ourselves from maybe our own personal disappointments, our own personal trauma, or our own fears of facing that which is wrong. We can breathe for a moment. I know this is a lot. But there are gospel truths that can strengthen us to face that which is wrong. There are gospel truths. And what I want to do is I want to walk us through the first part of the psalm, those that I referred to earlier, where David brought this unbelievable revelation as to what a real relationship with God looks like, that set up why he was able to pray this way to God. I said to pray through these things, we need to be the hater. But secondly, we also need to be known. Listen to the kind of relationship David experienced with God that we can experience we can experience from God through the gospel. It says, "You have searched me, Lord, and you know me. You know when I sit. You know when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You are familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you, Lord, know it completely. You hem me in behind and before, and you lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too lofty for me to attain." David is talking about how God knows him. He knows the way he thinks. He knows the ways he goes about things. He's familiar with his ways. He knows even what he's thinking, even what he's going to say before he even says it. He knows the boundaries of his life. He hems them in before and behind. There's knowledge that God has of David that David will never understand. And that's true for me and for you. God knows your thoughts. He knows what you would say before you'd say it. He knows you better than you know yourself. There will be things that you'll never know about yourself that God has always known. He knows why you react the way you do. He knows why you get upset in that moment. He knows why you're afraid. He knows why you hold back. He knows why you always have to charge in. He knows. He knows you. I've taken the time over the years to use personality profiles to understand myself, and each one shows me something different, and that's helped me with my family. It's helped with our team. Each one shows a little bit more, but there are libraries about you that you still don't know. There's libraries about me that I don't know. God knows, and He still pays attention. He still loves. He still cares. He sees you. One of the phrases that popped up in the pandemic that just caught way more traction, particularly after George Floyd died in the Me Too movement, people would say, "I see you." That's a helpful phrase because when you're lonely, you feel like nobody sees you. It feels like you're not known, you're not understood. I remember being 24 and I got let go. I was a youth pastor and I got let go by the church. And it wasn't the worst thing in the world. Trust me, it wasn't that bad. But for me, it was a really big deal at the time. And I remember, I don't know what I'm going to do. I was like, I went to Grotto's Pizza and bought myself a slice of pizza. And I remember walking around and saying to myself, "Guys, don't you know everything's changed? And you're just going about your day?" I remember that as I've lost loved ones. When I can hear the news of, like, when my father died or my mother died or my niece died, I remembered just moving through life feeling like everything's changed and everybody else is just kind of moving along. That's when a well-timed word, a reminder, it's like, I know it's hard. I know you are grieving. I know that you are going through a really sad time. Even though they're not as sad as I am about it, just knowing that somebody else knows that matters. God sees your grief. He sees your sadness. He knows your loss. He knows the loss better than you do. In prayer, we can bring those kinds of things, those kind of things that are necessarily lonely. Suffering is necessarily lonely. We can be the only one suffering what we are suffering, and we can bring that before God and be known. Very early in the Bible, Abraham and Sarah were promised a child. It had been 20 years. The child hadn't come, and Sarah looked at Abraham and was like, I don't know how this is going to work. Why don't you sleep with Hagar? And Abram sleeps with his servant, and sure enough, she gets pregnant. And just as you can imagine, there's a whole big mess of drama right after that, right? And Hagar gets abused. She feels awful. She feels like she has an enemy, and she runs. She runs away from her family, whom she had been serving. She's alone in the wilderness. She's all by herself. And the angel of the Lord comes to her and says, I see you. I understand you. I'm going to bless you, and you're going to have my favor, and I want you to go back to your family. And something happens in the Bible that, for those who might struggle thinking that the Bible is made up by like politicians trying to cling to power or whatever, you have to grapple with passages like this. 4,000 years ago, 1,800 years before Christ, Hagar, who was an Egyptian marginalized female, gets to be the first person in the Bible to name God. And she names God El Roi, the God who sees me. When you know that God sees you, you don't feel as intimidated by your enemies. You don't feel as overwhelmed by evil. The psalm teaches us to be the hater, to be known, to be with. Verses 7 to 12, I'm just going to read. Listen to the intimacy of David's relationship with God. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast. If I say, surely darkness will hide me, and the light become night around me, even the darkness will not be dark to you. The night will shine like the day, for darkness is as light to you. God's everywhere. God is everywhere. There's no place that you're going to go that you could hide from him. Introverts, you can't turn inward far enough to get away from God. Busy little extroverts, you can't outwork and run ahead of God. You can't get away from him. For a lot of Americans, I find many of us, and I found myself just busy because I don't want to deal with the emotions of the disappointments of the evil I've seen. And therefore, it becomes difficult to pause to pray because then I'm not so sure the feelings I'm going to feel. But what ends up happening is in that busyness, we begin dividing ourselves between the person we present to others in the light, hey, everything's really, really good, and that disappointed part of ourselves that we're working so hard to not have to deal with. And we think that person's in the dark, but God sees that person. And God can be with that person. When we know that God is with us, we're not as activated by evil. We're not afraid of enemies. we have the ability to pray our enemies, pray for them. Finally, we can be formed. And the intimacy in this prayer continues. As David continues, he says, "For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. How precious to me are your thoughts, God. How vast is the sum of them. Were I to count them, they would outnumber the grains of sand. When I am awake, I am still with you." We sang of a God, of a King of Kings who had a master plan, who's carrying this out throughout all history. That same God who's got a plan for all history has a plan for you that's been at work since the womb, forming you. God has envisioned how you would be physically. He envisioned your body. Envisioned you to be exactly the way you are, to strengths and weaknesses, hurts and helps, abilities and inabilities. God planned for you, envisioned you. He envisioned your unformed body and formed you there for a very specific person. Every day of your life is known by God. You can't even run from him by getting to tomorrow. Every day is a formation in a relationship with God. Even Jesus needed to be formed. Jesus didn't just pop into this earth. He was born into this earth after being in a womb for 9 months. He didn't just jump right into ministry. He had to grow up, have acne, make mistakes, learn a trade, and then begin a ministry in his adulthood. He didn't just jump into ministry and it was all up and to the right. He had to go through the wilderness. He had to be tested. He had to be tempted. He had to suffer fasting. He had to suffer evil. He had to suffer opponents. Every aspect of that Jesus' life was being formed. How much more will our lives be formed? Every day of your life, God sees. Every day of your life is a day to yield to him and to his purpose for you. His protective purposes for you. His guidance for you. He knows your thoughts and he knows his way. He will let you have your thoughts in your way, but he has a way that you can yield to. Our world needs this kind of hope. That lives matter, that every day matters, that there's a God that overcomes evil and enemies. And you know what this next 15 months are going to be like? People are going to be running around in political hysterics, how the Dems are coming for them, and the Trumps and blah, blah, blah. It's going to be all this stuff, and it's all going to be this one big, big distraction about like the false enemies and all this stuff, and all of the government, the justice, all this stuff, right? Your phone's going to continue to cry out, pull you away from people, say, no, you're the victim, come to me. Our world needs people who aren't reactive. Our world needs people who can look at evil and pray about evil. Our world needs people who can look at the fact that there is darkness, there's enemies, but it's not the people around them. It's not the people that disagree with them, that there's a much darker enemy that Jesus has already defeated. That yes, we are fighting a battle, but a battle that he has already won. It's dark, but we are people of hope, and our world needs hope. And where do we experience that? In prayer. When we become the people of prayer, to learn to pray like normal people, we bring that kind of hope wherever we go. And man, this world